Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War news update, third part thereof for the 22nd of June 2024. This is a Geopolitics video. We're going to start with what I started the day with when I did my breaking news update concerning Nigel Farage. So who is Nigel Farage? He is the leader of the Reform UK party, which is essentially an analogue to some degree from a kind of Trumpian MAGA party in the UK. Now, I know many of you of my viewers are potential reform voters. They are basically I'm being dismissive when I say a one-trick pony, but they really are a single issue party in terms of they're big on immigration. So it's not to say there aren't issues with immigration. I don't want to get into that debate, right? But if immigration is your thing, then reform speak to you. And so a lot of people are really considering voting reform. The problem is when it comes to many of their other policies, they're interesting reform because actually they do have an eclectic mix of policies. I think this is a good look. This is a Daily Telegraph piece, Reform UK Manifesto, or what he calls a contract, Farage's key policies at a glance. Some of them are actually, so they sit to the right. Reform, they're to the right of the Conservative Party, but actually they do have some left-wing economic policies. So for example, when you look at transport, and we'll go down there, these are, and I think this is to appeal to the working class left-wing voter that they stole when they were UKIP. So they were UKIP, they came from Brexit Party, then they came Reform. In that whole process, they took a whole load of left-wing, red wall, northern Labour voters away. And this time round, they want to try and keep them, but they seem to be mainly taken from Conservatives, and the Labour voters have gone back home to roost. But since Nigel Farage has come along, some of those Labour voters are coming with Farage. But to get some of those Labour voters, left-wing voters on side, they need to appeal to some of those policies. They can't just sit on we're going to be strong on immigration. What about everything else? And in fact, their policy is generally kind of pie in the sky, as in they don't need to have a fully costed manifesto because they're not really going to get into government. So people the people in the media are not giving Farage and other reform politicians enough criticism and scrutiny over their actual policies that go beyond migration. Anyway, when it comes to transport, they're looking to bring 50% of the utility companies under public ownership. So yeah, they want to make government small here, there, and usual kind of right wing over to further to the right. They want to scrap this and scrap that and tear down red tape and get rid of environmental legislation, but at the same time take 50% of the utilities under public ownership. So there's a really interesting mix. Anyway, let's give you a for those international viewers an understanding where they are. They're basically a populist party that are running on immigration, but a few other bits and pieces thrown in. Now, bearing in mind that Trump's just come out and said, NATO have been very provocative with regard to how, the situation in the Ukraine war and kind of who started it, this kind of, it's the West provocation, which is bizarre that you'd get an American candidate or nominee going down that route. Because it's almost saying it's US imperialism what did it. Farage then came out and said this last night in an interview.
I stood up in the European Parliament in 2014 and I said, and I quote, "There will be a war in Ukraine." Why did I say that? It was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man a reason to his Russian people to say they're coming for us again and to go to war.
But you were echoing him.
Sorry?
You were echoing him. That's what Putin says.
No. Sorry, I've been saying this actually since the 1990s. Ever since the fall of the wall. But hang on a second. We've provoked this war. It's, of course it's his fault. He's used what we've done
we
as an
provoked
excuse.
the invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, and very interesting, once again, 10 years ago when I predicted this, by the way, I'm the only person in British politics that predicted what would happen.
There's all sorts of craziness going on here, right? And he's trying to get away with saying it's Putin's fault but also saying it's our fault, we provoked them, the ever eastward expansion. And I talked about this in my breaking news, so I don't want to go over the old ground too much, but I thought I'd play you what he said.
And of course, everyone said I was a pariah for daring to suggest it. George Robertson, former Labour cabinet minister, who went on to become the Secretary General of NATO, has in the last couple of weeks said the war is a direct result of EU expansionism.
But I'm asking you about, because it's your judgment, you want to be Prime Minister. Let me ask you about someone else.
My judgment has been way ahead of everybody else's in understanding this.
My judgment is way ahead of everyone else in saying it's the West's fault, in being pro-Putin. So you've been pro-Putin for a long time. And the reality is, he has been pro-Putin for a long time. So he talks about, I was saying this in 2014. Here's an article from 4 years ago, where when he was MEP with the Brexit Party, or when this was in the iteration of the Brexit Party, they voted against tighter... they voted against Europe tightening restrictions against Russian propaganda. It's absolutely insane. So the resolution, passed by 469 votes to 143 with 47 abstentions, revealed the bitter division among Britain's members of European Parliament. The Liberal Democrats said they were shocked and appalled. The Brexit Party had voted against measures to tackle fake news. This is really important. I need to give you this context. Quote, it's frankly shocking that the Brexit Party MEPs today refuse to support enhanced measures to tackle attacks on our democratic processes from Russia and elsewhere, said Catherine Bearder, the leader of the Lib Dem MEPs. Quote, they wrap themselves in the Union flag, but they repeatedly fail to protect our national interests and do what is best for Britain. This is absolutely correct. And this just shows you how under the sphere of influence at the time the Brexit Party, and now you can argue the Reform Party, is in terms of Russia. The Brexit Party, which abstains or opposes most European Parliament votes, hit back at the claims, quote, we will always vote against more power and spending by the EU, said David Bull, a Brexit Party MEP. We won't take lessons in democracy from parties which have packed together in order to frustrate the Brexit vote. Stories of Russian interference have been exposed as baseless propaganda and scare stories used to shut down debate. As a party of free speech, we oppose shutting down debate. And of course, that's ostensibly nonsense, as in there is empirical evidence that there is indeed huge amounts of Russian propaganda. Gee whiz, we talk about it every day. Like, you cannot deny that. And I know this is going back 4 years, but in 2020, there was empirical evidence of it being there then. In fact, there are reports from social media companies of the meddling in Brexit. But of course, that's not going to be something they're going to admit to here. You know, you've got Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it's just... Yeah, this is the positioning of Nigel Farage prior to taking on his mantle as Reform leader. Now, this has gone down very badly with lots of people in the UK political scene right across the parties, and I talked about that earlier. I won't go over that again. So, people have been condemning this. Saying that you've now got Trump and Farage, and remember Farage was going to be campaigning for Trump for his presidential campaign, and he was not going to run as a politician for Reform, and then he did a bit of a switch, but he should be technically in the US at the moment campaigning for Trump. They get on very well together, they're peas from the same pod, so he is it's no surprise that both of them are saying the same things about NATO expansionism. And yeah, lots of people are really angry about this, finding it to be pretty disgraceful. And in fact, I've had many of you say that you were going to vote Reform, but actually this has turned you off Reform. And the problem is that Reform really is a one-trick pony, as I say, with policies in the main. They do have other policies, but I think they're serious about those. If you don't, I don't know, if you don't fancy Reform, I think you'll probably go back to, if you are a Conservative voter, back to the Conservatives, and I think it would be a far more sensible option than it would be to vote for Reform. The mask slips, says Guy Verhofstadt. These are Kremlin talking points. In the European Parliament, Farage always defended Putin. Every vote for Farage is celebrated in Moscow. So this is being generally accepted. But yeah, I think we need to understand where he was coming from. Now, a couple of things to note. Worth remembering, says Luke Trill here, that unlike in the USA, there is almost no cleavage on support for Ukraine here in the UK. 74% of Brits think it's important for us to have, us here in the UK, that Ukraine wins. Just 9% think it is unimportant. Ukraine's skepticism is very unpopular here. And he also said one area Brits don't want to see a partisan divide is support for Ukraine. Our new polling today, The Sun, finds 74% think it is important to the UK that Ukraine wins. So there you go. And this is why I think this is actually strategically a very bad position for Farage to have taken. Even if he believes that, he should have stayed quiet about that last night, or just kind of lied about it. If it's more important that he keeps his vote, because I think reform will. I think this is strategically very bad for reform. It's also a real just crying shame that you've got a platform for pro-Russian propaganda inside the UK in our parliamentary landscape, rather like you've got a platform for Russian propaganda with people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I would argue Donald Trump as well. Anyway, there's been a really strong reaction as the day has gone on. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, and Keir Starmer, probably our next Prime Minister, both condemned Farage for his claim that the West provoked the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the Prime Minister saying it, quote, plays into Putin's hands, and a Labour leader describing it as disgraceful. Farage claimed that made the claim on Friday in a BBC Panorama interview, drawing a link between NATO and EU expansion in recent debates on the conflict in Eastern Europe. Asked by broadcasters about the remarks during an election campaign visit in London on Saturday, Rishi Sunak said, quote, what he said was completely wrong and only plays into Putin's hands. This is a man, Mr. Putin, who deployed nerve agent on the streets of Britain and who is doing deals with countries like North Korea. And this kind of appeasement is dangerous for Britain's security and security of our allies that rely on us, and only emboldens Putin further. It is absolutely right. So what Farage has done, I mean, Sunak nails it here. What Farage has done is completely irresponsible, and it's dangerous for the UK. It's dangerous for our politicians to be espousing those views. In the same way, I say it's insanely dangerous that these views are being allowed to germinate in Congress, on the floors of Congress in the United States, with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, as I say, and Matt Gaetz and Paul Gosar and Tommy Tuberville, and all these politicians that are just sucking up that pro-Kremlin narrative, and indeed, sadly, with Trump as well. Starmer said Farage, so he's likely the next PM, said Farage's comments were disgraceful and that Russia bore sole responsibility for the invasion of Ukraine. Brilliant that we got bipartisan unity here. Speaking to reporters at a campaign event in London, the Labour leader said, quote, anyone who is standing for Parliament ought to be really clear that Russia is the aggressor. Putin bears responsibility and that we stand with Ukraine as we have done from the beginning of this conflict. Parliament has spoken with one voice on this since the beginning of the conflict. Absolutely bloody right, and so it should. And this kind of divisiveness is absolutely unwarranted and unwanted in the UK political scene. Starmer added that Labour was unshakable in our commitment to NATO because this is about defending Ukraine, but this is also about defending our hard-won democracy and freedom, and anybody standing for public office ought to understand that. You've got the Lib Dems coming out as well, James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary at the moment. You've got the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace saying really strong criticism against Farage. And then just at the end here, Farage, a former member of the European Parliament, also said in his interview, well, you know what he said. He said he had been making similar comments since the 1990s. The former Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey said Farage would, quote, rather lick Vladimir Putin's boots than stand up for the people of Ukraine. Well said. And former Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood, so he's a Tory politician, Conservative politician from, is it Christchurch, Bournemouth area, where he's a veteran himself, so he's very much involved in, I think, is he in charge of a Defence Select Committee? Or anyway, he told the Daily Telegraph that Churchill will be turning in his grave over the remarks. This has gone down very badly politically, and I hope he is taken to task by his own party, by Reform, saying, if you are a Reform supporter and you're still going to vote for him, and even if you're not, please contact him and say, what are you doing? This is clearly nonsense, and he is just playing into the dictator's hand. But it's almost like what we see on the far left. So the far left, so what's been interesting about this response, the response to this in public is I've said, I said on Facebook earlier that it's interesting. A number of viewers of mine who were going to vote Reform have said they're not going to based on this. And my mate Tom Williamson, who comments here, has said that, interestingly, some of his friends have said, I totally disagree with Farage, but I agree on NATO expansionism. So these are left of centre of friends of Tom's. And this doesn't surprise me at all, because I fight with people who are anti-US imperialism, who take that left-wing approach, and that's somewhere I used to be, but I've learned an awful lot in the last couple of years, where I much better understand geopolitics and why there are US strategies like they are. Now, I do disagree that the Iraq War. I think the Iraq War was deeply problematic, and I think there's been US imperialism into South America. John Pilger's War on Democracy is a very good. He's just died recently, John Pilger, but that's an excellent window into how the US has got involved in democratic outcomes that they think don't align with them strategically. But I think on Ukraine, the US strategy, I'm not talking about the ins and outs of like Biden and slow rolling aid, but the positioning of where the US is absolutely bang on correct. It's like, yeah, Russia, the bad guys, we need to help Ukraine are the good guys. And it's that simple. And it's not NATO's responsibility. It's not Victoria Nuland's responsibility. It's Putin's responsibility. And little green men in 2014 invaded Ukraine, illegally taking off their insignia, and they didn't have anything to do with NATO expansionism, because that wasn't talked about at all. It got very little discussion in Putin's essay, 7,000-word essay that he put out prior to the 2022 invasion. So NATO expansionism is a post hoc rationalization that is used as an excuse. Now, it may be that Farage is saying, oh, this has given him an excuse, but you're still saying that's a provocation, Farage. You very clearly think it's eastward expansionism from NATO that is the provocation here, and that is just not cool. Anyway. Where was I? So essentially, this is not gone down well at all in the UK, and I think that is very poor strategizing. But as I said earlier, this is a mind virus that has been infecting people's minds, and it gets into super spreaders like Farage, like Gates, like Trump, like the AfD, like Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella, all these people who then have a platform and they spread that virus into the minds of other people. Here, Jane Kiev points out that in 2024, Biden is against 3 Kremlin-backed candidates. So you've got, Jill Stein, and you've got Robert Kennedy, and you've got Donald Trump, all who are espousing pro-Kremlin talking points. Here he talks about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who RFK Jr. has just come out and said, well, here, Robert Brainworm Kennedy meeting his daily quota of laundering verbatim Russian propaganda narratives to US audiences. So, okay, what does Robert Kennedy have to say? US says Ukraine can hit inside Russia anywhere its forces attack across the border. So we are saying that's not enough. Robert Kennedy is saying escalation has a terrible logic all its own. We should have learned this in Vietnam. Remember the helicopters leaving the American embassy in Saigon? Similar scenes in Afghanistan. Eventually, we will have to pull out the advisors and their supply lines, exhausted, wounded, and with nothing really accomplished except death, destruction, and new levels of global animosity. Yeah, or the alternative is let Putin do what he likes, destroy Ukraine, take it under his auspices, and then move on to the rest of Europe and embolden himself and him and Russia with China. Yeah, Kennedy, because that's a sensible idea, isn't it, mate? Right, anyway, he continues. It was the Vietnam War which changed global perceptions of the moral leadership of the United States. It will be Ukraine that cements those perceptions in the minds of the targeted and their many allies. Many of the undecided are now choosing BRICS instead of NATO for moral and economic reasons, and they're easy to understand. In this war, America is risking death on its own sword. Like, it's so deeply naive. What I'd love to do, I'd love to be interviewing Robert Kennedy and say, look, Mr. Kennedy, let's sit down, let's talk about this, right? I'm not going to argue with you at the moment. What I want to do is steel man you. I'm not going to straw man you. I'm not going to bring up a version of your arguments that is the weakest version and try and tear that down. That's a straw man. I want to steel man you. I want you to give the strongest sense of what your arguments are by allowing you to say them yourself. So I'd like you now, Robert Kennedy, on TV, I'd like you now to tell me how you understand the history of this conflict in Ukraine and how you think it started. Tell me from start to finish. Do you know what? If it takes 2 hours, let's let it take 2 hours. You tell me how you understand this right? And we'll see if this is garbage in, garbage out. Because if your conclusions are based on a really, really faulty understanding of how this war started, and I would say the same to Trump, because I don't think Trump understands jack here. I would say the same to many people. How do you understand this? And that will give us a sense of where you're at. Right, on the US, they've closed the Russian visa center and they're depriving diplomats of tax privileges. Both branches of the visa center in Washington and New York will be closed. Quote, now Russian diplomats and consuls will have an additional burden on their shoulders, the Russian ambassador to the US said. Oh, boo-hoo. And Ukraine and the EU may sign an agreement on security guarantees on June the 26th, according to De Welt, German media source. The EU says it will sign a security agreement with Ukraine in the coming days, according to DW. Zelensky will sign that on Wednesday, June the 26th. Excellent news. 2 more island countries. I don't know if some others have done before this, so this may be another 2, or it could be 2 on top of what is now, well, the latest I heard, 77. So you had 80 nations signing the communique from the Peace Summit in Switzerland. Then some dropped out. You had Jordan and someone else dropping out. And then you had, Rwanda dropped out as well. So it went down to 77. And they could be back up. Well, this would appear to show it's at least 79. 2 more countries, Barbados and Marshall Islands, have joined the communique on the Peace Summit that was announced by the President of Ukraine. Excellent stuff. Now, this might take a little bit of time, but this is a super amazing interview in the Kyiv Independent. So it really is insane. Ex-defense minister on Slovakia's pro-Russian turn. So the ex-defense minister and foreign minister, I think, are being taken to court, or there's a criminal investigation of how they got MiG-29s to Ukraine, right, when it was a previous government. And then Robert Fico won with the help of Hungary's Viktor Orban, by the way. He then formed a coalition government with the far right and then another party. And he's moved to the populist right, and it's basically a pro-Putin government. Now, this interview is fascinating. For all the reasons you're going to find out. So we're going to go through quite a bit of this. Sorry, not sorry. Right, so this is Yaroslav Nad. He says, I wasn't surprised about the MiG-29 fighter jet thing, because the current ruling government in Slovakia consists of 3 political parties, and all 3 of those parties claimed even before the election that they consider any military help to Ukraine to be treason, and that they would like to sue us. They had submitted their proposal for us to be accused of treason and for mismanagement of state property several times already, but every time in the past it was dismissed, and I hope that justice still exists in Slovakia, and there will be the same result again. Honestly, if somebody accuses me officially of treason for providing Ukraine with MiG-29s or S-300 air defense system, that would be probably the only case in the world where somebody could be prosecuted for helping Ukraine militarily. It really is insane, and I still believe that even though here is a lot of pressure from the government on police and prosecutors to find any way to accuse us officially, I don't think this will happen. Fingers crossed, right? And then, how do these leaders explain and sell this to their electorate? First of all, they won the election on being very much anti-Ukrainian and very much pro-Russian. Now they're actually paying back their voters. They're playing the same game they were playing before the election. And it's all very irresponsible behavior. It talks about, how they're morally compromised and so on and so forth. Then the Kyiv Independent asks, what do they hope to happen? Nad says, honestly, I simply don't understand them. There was a meeting of our foreign minister with the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. I reported this recently, where the Slovakian foreign minister went to Moscow to meet the Russian foreign minister. You're like, what are you doing? Like, why? No one else is doing this apart from maybe Hungary. No one else is doing this. What are you doing, Slovakia? Anyway, Nad says, which was really insane. Second, there was an inauguration of the new president of Slovakia. So as well as Robert Fico, the prime minister, that you had the presidential election where they got rid of the previous, is it Kapitova? She was a green. She was really good, really pro-Ukraine. And then replaced them with Pellegrini, who is the same mould as Robert Fico and very pro-Russia. President comes from the current ruling coalition, and he officially invited the Russian ambassador to be part of his inauguration, which is, for me, absolutely against normal thinking. At the bilateral meeting of Slovak and Ukrainian prime ministers, they signed a joint communique, but the next day, Prime Minister Fico claimed that whatever he signed didn't have any real impact. He said in the meeting that Slovakia supports the Euro-Atlantic integration integration of Ukraine, which is good. But then he said he actually doesn't think so, and Ukraine should not be in the EU, certainly not in NATO, and Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the world. So I really don't understand the rationale behind it. The only thing that I see is that they would like to get this pro-Russian electorate, which they actually created in Slovakia themselves with this rhetoric. So it's this circular thing where you say, oh, look at all this pro-Russian sentiment when you've been feeding these seeds of discord and pro-Russian propaganda into the electorate. You then get them to bubble up and you say, oh, look at them. Yeah, these all people are pro-Russian, so we're going to feed them more overtly. And it's a circular process that takes place, which they actually created in Slovakia themselves with this rhetoric. The other explanation could be that they are paying back Russia for supporting them in the election campaign. So Russia supported them, then they need to be seen to be doing things that are pro-Russian in order to thank Russia for helping them get into power. Yaroslav Nad later says the country is very much polarized. So I gave a speech in Huntsbourne Tarrant, lovely village in north of Hampshire, and it was a delight to speak to some of you guys. Rob and Denisa came from Bristol, all the way from Bristol to the talk, and it was great to speak to them personally. And Denisa was born in Czechoslovakia, and then it obviously became Czechia, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. But she said she had recently visited Slovakia, and she said she was amazed that, like old and young, that there were pro-Russian propaganda was rife in the electorate amongst people that she was speaking to. She's like, what are you doing? What are you thinking? And of course, it's what they read, what they hear, and it's this information ecosystem. You know, it's the ecosystem that Donald Trump and David Sachs and Elon Musk exist in, and the Nigel Farage existing. No wonder you have these opinions if you're going to surround yourselves in this and snowball on and on. Yes, you can accuse that of me, but actually, I'm looking at all of this, and I think I'm very much justified in looking into history at what's actually happened and getting a much greater grasp of the reality of the political situation around Europe and with regard to Ukraine and Russia. But people living in these ecosystems then obviously become victim to them. And as Nad says here, the country is very much polarized. I would say it's almost 50-50. It also depends on the educational level of the population. As a matter of fact, the Slovak population is very much under pressure from Russian propaganda, disinformation campaigns, and people have a tendency to believe in many strange things. During the pandemic and then later during the war in Ukraine, I would say we were number 2 from the bottom in the EU and NATO countries, just after Bulgaria, when it comes to believing Russian propaganda. It really is a big problem. People in Slovakia really believe that it is the US who started the war and that Russia is only a victim. The only way to change this is to improve, first and foremost, policy on fighting disinformation campaigns and propaganda, which will not happen until under this government. They actually cancelled or dismissed all the structures that we created to fight Russian propaganda and disinformation. And then we're going full circle and back to Nigel Farage voting on stopping tightening of regulation against Russian disinformation and propaganda in the EU. That's who Nigel Farage is. Be under no illusion. Who butters his bread, right? And so I'd love to see funding of reform where that's come from and whether Russia can be traced at all back to Russia. But you've got to remember that A, Russia are the bad guys, and B, they are winning the information war. They're winning the information war. Nad then says later, what I see in Fico is a kind of envy towards Viktor Orban, I'd say a dictator-in-chief or authoritarian leader of Hungary, because he would like to have the kind of support that Orban has. But this will not happen. Fico has a majority now, but a very slim majority in parliament. Yes, Orban helped Fico a lot during the campaign behind the scenes, but also using Hungarian media and social media campaigns boosted by the Hungarian government and targeting Slovakia. There is evidence that these campaigns on Facebook and Instagram reached more than 1.5 million voters in Slovakia just before the election. So yes, this cooperation between Orban and Fico is significant. Fico would like to mirror many of Orban's policies and decisions. On the other hand, I saw the misuse of Fico's assassination attempt by Orban in Hungary, claiming that it was carried out by a leftist and trying to use it in his own campaigning. And of course, that wasn't the case. Nad then goes on to say, from answering from your perspective, how should other EU countries deal with this in practical terms? It's extremely difficult, I can tell you that. There is a rising adversity, I would say, among EU and NATO members for Hungary, especially Hungary, to blackmail. I cannot find any other term for that, to blackmail others with their position. Regarding the mid-29th of donation, the reimbursement for them through the European Peace Facility was not finalised because Hungary is still blocking this in payment. Both the EU and NATO are trying to find a way to communicate with Hungary. It's not an easy decision to get rid of the veto right or the consensus policy in the EU and NATO, but the more Hungary plays this game, the more probable it is that they will have to pay for it eventually. Hungary is, of course, playing a very dangerous game, given their own sort of future power and whatnot. So far, we see that what we see is that Hungary and Slovakia have not been invited to several high-level meetings. You can read the official position of the Czech Prime Minister, who officially said that he was forced to change his speech when he was travelling to Paris for a meeting on Ukraine once he learned that Fico would be there, even though he wasn't invited previously. He, Peter Fiala, was afraid that his remarks would end up in the Kremlin. There is significant mistrust towards Slovakia and Hungary among allies in the EU and NATO. The only happy person out of this reality is Vladimir Putin, but this is also the result of democratic election. The majority of Slovakia voted in favour of Fico and his government. The only people who can change this again are the Slovak citizens in the next election. Obviously, people from the opposition, people from independent media, people from NGOs, all of us together, we have to hold Fico and his government to account. Now, this then comes back to, it's a free and fair election, but it's not a free and fair election because it's all about the knowledge of the electorate. If you can manipulate the knowledge of the electorate, you are manipulating the election. It's not free and fair. And so we often think that elections, something like an election like in Slovakia, where you have a look around and you say, well, the voting's fine. There's no like hassling of people at the voting booths and so on and so forth. It's a free and fair election. But actually, the work on the evaluation of whether something is a free and fair election absolutely needs to take into account the media landscape, the information landscape within the country, and the meddling that takes place, the nefarious activities that Russia is involved in to manipulate the electorate to vote. And we saw that then when you had Fico in and the presidential campaign came along, Pellegrini was kind of bribing the electorate with sweeteners to get him voted in. And then you get a more complete control of the country. Then you can start democratically backsliding because you've got the president, you've got the prime minister, you can start changing the judiciary and the rule of law. And then you control the media and then you control the narrative. And then you get Hungary and you get Viktor Orban and you get the closing down of universities because they're all too liberal. And all of this is caused by the evil George Soros. He's a Jew and he's responsible for everything. And there you go. That's Hungary for you. It's just democratic backsliding that gets chipped away. Democratic institutions and mechanisms get chipped away over time. And before you know it, you are the lobster that's boiled in the pot and you didn't realise it and you're dead. You're politically dead. So he goes on to talk about other things. I'll leave it here, but, talking about Russian involvement and having to be really careful because, it's all so depressing. Okay. In Germany, 3 people have been arrested for allegedly spying on Ukraine or spying on behalf, I presume, of the Russians. 3 men were arrested in Germany on suspicion of cooperating with a foreign secret service. German Federal Prosecutor's Office reported yesterday. And on top of that, a Russian citizen has been detained in Montenegro at the US request over alleged election interference, a Russian PSYOP operator. This is just happening all over Europe. Now, the great thing, Ukraine won their latest Euro 2024 match. They lost the first one against Romania, 3-0. They won 2-1 against Slovakia, of all countries. And now we've had these Polish people outside the Russian Russian embassy in Germany, I presume in Berlin, don't know for sure. And they're basically shouting Russia whore outside the embassy. I mean, they're letting their views be known about who are the bad guys and what they think of Russia. So thank you, the Polish football fans. Not often I'd say that. Polish Defence Ministry have reported deterioration of the border with Belarus. Armed and well-trained groups are attacking. The use of warning shots has become more frequent. In May of this year alone, this measure was used 770 times and about 300 times in 2023. Quote, the situation at the border is complicated. On the other side of the border, we are dealing with specialised groups that are attacking the Polish border, not seeking asylum in Poland, said the country's Minister of National Defence. It's becoming an issue. It's being weaponized by Belarus is a claim, and that has been the case actually for some time now. French Aid to Ukraine reports on that some military personnel are worried about the rise of Rassemblement National in France because actually it will have an effect on the kind of military positioning of France. A few days before the first round of the snap general election, some 20 French soldiers expressed their fear of a possible far-right government. Quote, I'm afraid of their positions on Russia and the conflict in Ukraine. I'm afraid of weakening in France and the international stage and of being on the wrong side of history with regard to Ukraine. These people dream of France becoming Russia or Hungary. I love my country as it is, despite its faults. At the moment, we have a good minister, a good chief of defence staff. The dynamics of aid to Ukraine are good. What a shame to ruin it all. So Sébastien Lecornu and others have seemed to be doing a fairly decent job in France, and so yeah, this is a real shame. Interesting view there. On the other hand, we've got the propagandists in Russia telling you how they think things should go. As said Skabieva, we should be willing to do anything and go all the way. Nothing like a good bit of nuclear genocide, as according to state-sanctioned propagandists in Russia. Now, for the first time, the Armenian parliament has discussed the possibility of the country becoming an EU member state. I think this is a long way off if it will ever happen, but it shows you the direction of travel for Armenia, who have been getting closer and closer to the EU, moving away from the Russian sphere of influence, with Pashinyan saying a lot of things as the Armenian prime minister that are not in alignment with what Russia would want. Indeed, France has been over there helping. There's no coincidence that Macron went over to Armenia, did some stuff, and then now you see Armenia are buying a load of Caesar self-propelled guns. So again, it's the idea of using the military-industrial complex as a political tool to be able to influence where countries are going. Politically speaking. But yeah, so Armenia seeming to be moving away from Russia there. Jimmy Rushton here, who is always worth listening to. He was on Ukraine, the latest podcast a couple of days ago. He's a Kiev-based foreign policy and security analyst, saying they should ask themselves why the Taiwanese government sees continuing US support to Ukraine and an eventual Ukrainian victory as critical for deterring Chinese aggression against Taiwan. So Phillips O'Brien commenting that all those brilliant US foreign policy thinkers claiming that US needs to stop helping Ukraine win because the US needs to confront China more might ask why China's policy is also to make sure Ukraine doesn't win. So let me get this straight. US aids Ukraine, this is terrible. US delivers resources. China aids Russia, this is brilliant. China divides US resources. Actually, folks, US aid to Ukraine is almost all old stuff that would be of no use to the Pacific. Plus, the way it works is that the US sends old stuff to Ukraine, costs it at replacement value as if it were new, and then builds brand spanking new stuff in place of the old that went to Ukraine. The US is not dividing its resources by helping Ukraine. It's rebuilding its military to allow it to better deter China. It's a really important point there. And so, whichever way you look at it, whether it's like in terms of the US's own military capability, helping Ukraine is beefing up the US military, is upgrading it, is modernizing the US military. So if you're saying we need to be preparing for China better, so we shouldn't be paying Ukraine anything, you don't understand stuff. You don't understand what's going on. The US is doing that. They are preparing for they are preparing for China by providing Ukraine with military hardware. But not only that, China is strategically looking at how the US and the EU and others are helping Ukraine, and that's informing what they do with Taiwan. So there's a double element to this. There are two elements to this, and I think it's really important that Ukraine are helped by the US in the context of China, and these two clearly understand that as well, obviously. Right, German economy minister during his visit to Beijing warned the Chinese authorities against cooperation with Russia. Quote, "We would act differently and certainly not so harshly when analysing the dependence on raw materials and technical goods if there were not this war or support in this war by China to Russia," Robert Habeck has said. So good for whatever that will do. That's the right kind of rhetoric. Anyway, that's enough from me. Really appreciate your support. Take care of yourselves, guys, and I'll speak to you soon. Toodle pips.